Hey everyone. One of the things about me, you might know this or you might not know, is that I firmly believe that everyone has a story. And I believe that no matter who you are, your story is powerful and it's important. That kind of informs my posture of curiosity when I meet somebody. I want to get to know their story. And I think our stories, your story, my story, they're powerful and important. One of the reasons why that's true is because our stories, they shape our identity. In many ways, our story is a record of the processes, of the life events, of what has made us who we are now. And actually, it provides a framework to understand almost everything about who we are. If I'm curious about your story, I get to understand some of the choices that you make now and the way you act and all that kind of stuff. And likewise, when you get to know my story, you get to go, oh, Ken will do this, Ken will do that, because I know who he is. I know his story. That's the power of stories. But it's not just your story telling you who you are, forming you, shaping you, being that record. Other people, actually, they want to share with you their story. They want to tell it to you because as much as your story has shaped you, the stories of others also can shape you. And that's particularly true when it comes to these bigger stories or meta stories. The story of our culture, our government, our workplace, obviously our families. The stories of our families are very influential on who we are, shaping us. But marketing companies, the whole advertising industry, they want to sell you a product, and they can do that by in a very powerful way by telling you a story. Now, some of these bigger stories, meta stories, are quite helpful. Others less so. But the common thing is that they all want to shape you. They all want to form you. And in terms of bigger stories, I don't think there's a bigger story or a greater meta story than the story of God. I think personally that God has a story. And I think that God's story tells us, I believe, who we're meant to be, who we were always meant to be. And it might surprise you, actually, what God's story says about who we are meant to be as humans. I believe, and you might agree or disagree, that's fine, but I believe that God's story is actually the story of us. It's the story of our true identity. And one of the key verses, I suppose, in the Bible that kind of shows us God's desire to shape us and to release our true identity is 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9. It says, "But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness and into his wonderful light." Now, in this New Testament verse, there's quite a few things in there, quite a few different facets of identity, and I think that they're all encouraging. But the facet of identity I really want to focus on today is this idea of being a priest. Now, I use that term priest and different ideas come to mind, but being priestly isn't just a job title. It is that, for sure, but it's also more than that. Being priestly is meant to be a part of everyone's story. A story for me, it's part of your story. It's meant to be part of all of our identity. Now, sometimes seeing who we are called to be can be illustrated by an opposite example. This is like kind of the anti-priestly identity. But what is really helpful in seeing who we can be and what our priestly identity is meant to look like is to look at the perfect example of a priestly identity. Someone who's truly living out their priestly identity. And there's a person like that in God's story. So let me read to you from the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, which tells us about the perfect priest. So Hebrews chapter 4, verse 14. "Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need." So the book of Hebrews, it was written, actually we don't know who the author is, and in many ways it's not like the other books of the New Testament. In many ways, it's almost like a sermon. It's meant to encourage, and it's meant to be practical for our everyday lives. And one of the ways in its kind of rhetoric, its sermon kind of delivery, one of the ways it encourages its readers and the audience for the book of Hebrews, as the name implies, were Jewish Christians. And maybe they were thinking, had they made the right choice in following Jesus? There's pressure to just go back to the Jewish community and not be Jewish Christians, just be Jewish. And so they're kind of thinking, did we make the right choice in following Jesus as the promised Messiah? So Hebrews encourages its Jewish audience, Jewish Christian audience, by showing them that following Jesus is better than the way things were done in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. And that following Jesus is better because Jesus is greater, Jesus is truer, and Jesus is actually the fulfillment of what the Hebrew Bible promises. And in terms of priestly identity, Jesus is the great high priest, the true priest who empowers all of us in our own priestliness. Let's have a look at verse 15 again. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way just as we are, yet he did not sin. So this is kind of like wrapping up this whole idea of the priestly identity and the story of us. And so we've looked at previous priestly examples, and all these previous priestly examples that taken from the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, all these previous priestly examples have led to Jesus. Jesus perfectly represented God to creation, and creation back to God. Remember, priest represents two parties, one to the other. So Jesus, fully human, fully God, he's fully able to represent divinity to humans, and he's fully able to represent humanity back to God. A perfect representative, able to bridge that gap completely. And he truly stood between the living and the dead. This is something else that the priests did. They stood between the living and the dead. Jesus selflessly carried blessing wherever he went. That was one of the roles of the priest, was to carry blessing. He perfectly carried God's name, perfectly represented God's name. That's what priests are meant to do. And he cleansed, clothed, and even redeemed us in all of our failed attempts at priestliness. We looked at the story of Joshua in the book of Zechariah, who was seemed like he might have been disqualified to be a priest, but was cleansed, clothed, and then empowered to be a priest. Jesus does that perfectly for us. And so we've looked at these people. I've mentioned some of them already, but we've looked at Moses as a priest, Aaron as a priest, Phineas as a priest, Joshua as a priest, Eli as a priest. All these priests from the Hebrew Bible. And actually, all of them point towards Jesus. Jesus is greater than all of them. They point to Jesus. For anyone who has ever felt like their efforts to live out their priestly calling has been interrupted or hijacked in some way, this verse about a great high priest who can empathize with us, this verse reminds us that Jesus has been in our footsteps. He's been tempted. He's been tried. He's gone through the same kind of obstacles, yet he overcame them. And so he's been in our footsteps. He knows those very feelings that we struggle with all the time. And he can truly empathize with us without judgment and without shame. That's not his posture. His posture is to lead us and into the fullness and the flourishing of our priestly identity. Looking back to verse 14, just the last part there, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. So, with so many things in life that can make us want to give up, just even beyond our own tendencies to make mistakes, there's so many other, there's the internal things, right? But there's so many external things that can make us want to give up. But actually, it's so encouraging to be reminded that this doesn't surprise God. God knows what we're going through. He knows the journey we're traveling on. He knows that sometimes it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. He knows the setbacks and the pushbacks. And he's included in his word, and we see in this passage, these constant reminders. Actually, it's not easy, guys. It's okay, but there's a purpose behind it all. And I want you to hold on and not give up. And so there's this reminder, there's this exhortation. The book of Hebrews is full of all these exhortations. Let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. There's this reminder. And you may think, oh, well, what's this promise that we're meant to hold on to? What are these outcomes that we're meant to be firmly holding on to? What are these ideas? What's this doctrine I need to be fully holding on to and not letting go of? And actually, it's not a particular promise, and it's not an outcome that we are encouraged to hold firmly onto. Actually, it's a person. This faith that we profess, it's not really just a bunch of ideas or doctrines or dogmas that we believe in. This faith that we profess is a person we put our trust in. The faith that we profess, that we're meant to hold on to tightly, is a king we've given our allegiance to. This faith that we profess, that we're not meant to let go of, it's a relationship with Jesus. So I don't know where you are in your journey, and you probably have a better idea, but you don't know exactly where you are in your journey either. So maybe breakthrough is just around the corner, or maybe breakthrough is 6 months away, 6 years away, 20 years away. So wherever we are in that journey, what we can do, and what God encourages us to in His story, is that we can hold on, knowing that intimacy is available to us here and now. We're not just holding on to ideas. We hold on to this faith that we profess, which is a person. It's Jesus. True God, true human, the true priest, the great high priest. Verse 16, let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. And so, this idea of approaching a throne of grace, beholding the face of God, coming into God's presence, these verses, they kind of they echo back to the priestly blessing of Numbers chapter 6. In Numbers chapter 6, Moses is told, this is how you will speak the blessing, or how Aaron, the high priest, will speak the blessing over the people of Israel. Numbers 6 verse 24 says, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make His face shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn His face towards you and give you peace. And so this verse in Hebrews about boldly coming into the presence of God, boldly coming in before the throne of God to receive grace and mercy in our time of need. This verse in Hebrews shows us that, and particularly in light of the priestly blessing of Numbers, this verse in Hebrews shows us God's desire to bless all people, to bless people with His protection, with His presence, with His peace. He wants people to come. He wants us, His image bearers, to come into His presence, where there's protection, where His face shines upon us, where He gives us grace and mercy in our time of need. He gives us His peace, His shalom, His flourishing. And so when you know the intentions of God, and that He's done everything to make it possible for us to be with Him, then I think having this confidence of coming into His presence, it's attainable. Sometimes we think, can I come into God's presence? Will He be angry with me? No, actually, we can have a sense of confidence, a sense of boldness coming into God's presence. We can know that calling on God, walking with the Holy Spirit and following in Jesus' footsteps, Jesus, the great high priest, the true priest, as we follow in His footsteps, that into the presence of God, that's the safest, most satisfying and flourishing place to be. There's actually, I think there's something liberating in knowing that the relational core of being priestly, that at the core of our priestly identity is this idea of relationship. And that because of a true high priest, the great high priest, Jesus, we can access this relational core through Jesus into the throne room of God, who we are meant to represent back to the rest of our world, Melbourne, our workplace, our neighbours, our family, our friends. We can come into God's presence because of Jesus. Receive that peace, that presence, that protection, and then go out from God's presence and representing God, which is what priests are meant to do, representing God back to the rest of our neighbourhood and our community. and that we can come into God's presence because of what the true priest has done, the great high priest, Jesus. We can come into the presence of God, and that our true priestliness, the full capacity of the image of God inside of us to be priestly can be released. Anyway, those are just my thoughts. I wonder what your thoughts might be, and so I've got some questions here for some discussion, and just take these as kind of to kickstart some discussion, and feel free to go wherever the conversation goes. But here's some questions to maybe prompt some further discussion. First group of questions: how do you feel when you hear that Jesus, as the great high priest, as the true priest, the priest that the rest of the Old Testament Hebrew Bible points towards? How do you feel when you hear that Jesus empathizes with our weaknesses? Does that challenge you? Does that comfort you? How do you respond to that emotionally? Next group of questions: what makes it hard to hold firmly to faith in our current season, in your current season? And how does it change things, this idea, this exhortation, this encouragement to hold firmly to the faith that we profess, when we remember that the faith we hold on to is not just an idea? It's kind of an idea. There's an intellectual side of it, but it's more than that. There's a relational side to it, that the faith that we profess is actually a person, the true high priest. And what makes approaching God boldly difficult for you? What makes it easy? What makes it easier? This whole idea of what makes Jesus the true priest, the great high priest, besides being fully God, fully human, is that he makes a way for us to come into the presence of God. Anyway, how does that all work for you? How do you think about it? How does it encourage you? Does it raise any questions for you? And then final group of questions: how might a deeper confidence in God's intentions to give us mercy and grace change the way that we might pray or live our lives this week? If we can come into the throne room of God with confidence to receive mercy and grace in our time of need, what difference does that make in our priestliness, in the way we represent God to those around us? How does it impact your priestly identity? Well, those are some of my thoughts. Love to hear some of yours somehow, but that's all from me. Thanks so much.